After 4 years of occupation in the Second World War, the world had missed France and wanted to hear from her again. Yes, Charles de Gaulle had kept the Free French forces in the public eye during the war, and there had been a resistance movement in France as well. But that was fighting in politics. What had been missing in occupied and Vichy France was what made France French, her unique way of looking at life through her lively, opinionated culture, expressed through fashion, art, literature, film, and philosophy. All of these had been largely smothered during the war years, with only a few people managing to infuse their artistic works with obliquely stated criticisms of the regime. Now, in 1946, the United States was about to receive an unofficial ambassador from France in the form of young Algerian-born Albert Camus. A product of the best and worst of the colonialist system in France, he was associated with an underground newspaper published by the resistance. More importantly, to an expectant New York City, he was a proponent and co-founder of a philosophical movement coming to be known as existentialism. We in New York wanted to hear thoughtful opinions about how a world had changed because of the war, and what might be a way of thinking that would prove useful in coping with the changes wrought in the world. After all, had mankind learned anything at all after 2 world wars and being capable of things like the Holocaust? And just as New York City was preparing for Camus, Camus was preparing for New York. He was making his first, and it would prove only, visit to our mythic, iconic city. Just as we had expectations of our visitor, so he had them about where he was going. How would Camus and New York City influence each other, and how would they both be changed? Tonight, we have 2 world-class writers and scholars who have reflected deeply on the man and his work. This discussion is part of a citywide series of varied events entitled Camus, A Stranger in the City, commemorating and celebrating the historic visit. Tonight, like our city after he left, we will be wiser than when we first met, thanks to our 2 speakers. Robert Zaretsky teaches courses in modern European intellectual and cultural history at the Honors College, University of Houston. He is the author of Albert Camus, Elements of a Life, and Camus, A Life Worth Living. He is also a frequent contributor to the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Los Angeles Times, Jewish Daily Forward, and many other publications. Adam Gopnik has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1986. He is the author of Paris to the Moon, Angels and Ages, and The Table Comes First. He is also the editor of a Library of America anthology book entitled Americans in Paris. He often writes about French culture and history for The New Yorker. And I've also been told that among the people in the audience, Antoine, the grandson of Albert Camus, is here. Would you mind standing up? Thank you so much for coming, and now on to our presentation.
Thank you. Rob, it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. For me, the event of this evening, no matter what Rob and I may say, is your... Oops. I have 2 mics on, so that might be affecting it. Is your presence. That so many people want to come out to think and talk and hear about Albert Camus in New York City in 2016 strikes me as remarkable, and it's wonderful to be in your company and in the company of the Camus family as well. Rob, when I think about Camus' visit here and when I think about Camus' example in America, I think about it sort of simultaneously on 2 levels. One involves a comedy of manners of the kind that almost always intercedes or intervenes when Americans and the French come together in one way or another. There's always that wonderful comedy of misunderstanding, of understanding, of attempting to understand, of failing to understand, of revising our misunderstandings, and finally ending up at some kind of communal, well-understood misunderstanding. And that happens when Camus came to New York. We get a lot of that. But at the same time, there are continuing profound lessons, as evidenced by the presence of these people in this room and by our continued fascination with Albert Camus, that I think transcend and escape the vagaries and the contingencies of the 1940s, New York and Paris. But let me try and make a little preliminary effort at articulating the way I see both of those levels. The comedy of misunderstanding, the comedy, of course, is evident, as we both know, and you've written about, I've written about in essay form. Camus' arrival here was the arrival to American intellectuals of an unusually glamorous figure, of a kind that they weren't quite prepared for. Now, as we all do, they were seeing what they expected to see. They expected to find a glamorous French intellectual, and so they saw one. And they imagined that they were seeing a model Frenchman, even though, as we all know, Camus in France would have been understood as a man of the South far more readily than as an archetypal Frenchman. Lionel Abel, one of the intellectuals of the Partisan Review Circle, said he's the most glamorous man I've ever met. And Camus himself was sufficiently flattered to write back home and to say, I think I could get a contract from a movie studio here. Camus, in turn, was entranced by New York, by its people, its romantic possibilities, and also, and it's been one of my favorite stories, it's always been one of my exemplary tales, Rob, misunderstood some of what he was seeing. At one point in his diaries, he says, or letter actually, he says that he's thinking of writing a book about New York that would be called The Island of the Three Rivers. And New Yorkers, of course, have a hard time figuring what that third river is. Now, of course, he means the Harlem River, and of course that's true, but it's not the way we conceptualize our own place, in exactly the same way that the way Americans who visit Paris tend to conceptualize it in ways that seem equally aberrant to the French. We build our own imaginary maps, and we impose them as much as we deduce them from our experience, and that was certainly true about Camus as well. The New York intellectual circle, of course, was fascinated by the idea of existentialism, what it meant, what it had. It was, I think I would suggest, Rob, the first in that sequence of kind of intellectual invasions, illuminations, call them colonizations of American intellectual life by the French mind, that began in the 1940s and then passed on through structuralism, deconstruction, and continues on to this day. That's a very special episode in the romance of France and America, not based on military aid or on cultural parasitism, but exactly on the power of French intellectual and philosophical ideas. I'm particularly drawn in that exchange, not so much, not primarily, and for reasons of my own self-interest, to the philosophical exchange, interesting though that is, as to the journalistic one. One of the most interesting exchanges in New York with Camus, for me, is his ongoing exchange, because they'd known each other in France, with A.J. Liebling, who's one of my heroes and was a great writer and a great Francophile at the New Yorker magazine. Now, in some ways, Camus and Liebling seem to be, if not opposites, they seem to be very, very different kinds of figures. We think of Camus as a philosophical novelist, and we think of Liebling as a comic essayist. Mm-hmm. And yet they had a genuine friendship. They shared an enormous experience. Liebling was probably one of the few Americans, one of the few people in New York who actually had an eye and sufficient experience for French life and French manners to place Camus properly. He knew that the glamorous suit Camus was wearing was 20 years out of date, because he had been in Paris and he understood French manners, he understood French fashion. And one of the things that fascinates me most, and that we've talked about, Rob, and I've written about a little bit, is Camus as a journalist. Now, journalist is not our most highly prized designation for an intellectual. And yet, for me, the most thrilling thing, the moment when I got turned from a Camus admirer to a Camus acolyte, was when, living in France, I began to read his collected journalism, particularly his editorials from the 1940s, and his notebooks from the same time. I think we do our favorite authors both a great service by making them compulsory reading in high schools, and we do them a horrible disservice. Their books sell, but they become attached to the miseries of 8th grade or 9th grade. And I had found The Plague and The Stranger had been attached to my own miserable 8th grade and 9th grade years. But discovering his journalism and the editorials he wrote in the 1940s was revelatory for me, because it showed that you could write weekly, indeed daily journalism at the highest possible level, not just of thought and reflection, but of style. And he attacked those problems as every time he had to write an editorial, he attacked it as a profound a problem of style as anything in Pascal. And he draws on that great French tradition of gravity, reflection, even a kind of sadness, to make his points. As an exercise in tone, in everything that we search for tonally in serious journalism, they remain for me utterly exemplary. And I read them and reread them all the time because they combine gravity of tone with the authority of sadness. Camus isn't ever ashamed, doesn't try to be relentlessly positive. He's lived through a terrible time. Something wonderful has happened, the liberation, but he doesn't have a shallowly exultant view of what's going on. It's hugely important. And the one other thing that I would emphasize that for me is crucial, and one of the things that Camus was trying to teach New York, and one of the things that New York had to learn from Camus, and that we still need to learn every day from Camus, or try to, was that if there was one lesson, it seems to me, Rob, that Camus had taken from the war, one fundamental idea. It wasn't the idea of existentialism, the myth of Sisyphus, the leap of faith, important though that was. It was the ongoing battle against abstraction. That's the theme that seems to me most vital to Camus and most relevant to our times. That Camus had come out of the war saying the horrible suffering and the evil had largely come from trying to treat questions of humanity as though they were questions of abstract thought. And that was the core, whether it was the ideological madness of Nazism and then of Stalinism, or whether it was simply the inability of the French ruling class or the French military class to deal with experiences that came at them because they were so entranced by the abstractions of their craft, the abstractions of their traditions, the abstractions of their maps and imaginary practices. One of my favorite stories about the onset of the war, Second World War, is Matisse and Picasso meet. And Picasso said to Matisse, well, what about our generals? Don't they have a plan? Meaning the French. And Matisse said, our generals, they're the professors at the School of Fine Arts, right? Meaning they just have their heads up their asses just as much as the people who try to teach you the right way to draw or the academic artists. I've always thought that was a Camus-like tale. And that battle against abstraction seems to me, if we had to take one lesson from Camus in the 40s, one ongoing legacy that still matters today, that more than any of the others, more than his struggle over Algeria, more than his quarrels with Sartre, more even than the very powerful and moving philosophy in The Revolt or in The Myth of Sisyphus, that for me is core Camus in 2016.
I agree. Am I using this correctly? Oh, great. Sorry. The chair keeps spinning, and I'll do my best to remain stationary. I think Adam is absolutely right on one of the key virtues that we ought to take from Albert Camus is this. You can't hear me. Can you hear me now?
You have to.
But it looks as if I'm praying.
It's the chair.
I'm sorry?
The chair, the seating, the way you're sitting is breaking away with breathing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yoga.
Let me do my best. Back to the question of abstraction. It's true that this is one of the key virtues that I too find in Camus' work and in his life. What he does in his journalism, and in fact the journalism doesn't begin in the 1940s, it actually begins earlier, it begins in the late 1930s, when, as an obscure university graduate who has held a few odd jobs and has started two theater troupes in the city of Algiers. He gets a job on a local paper, a startup known as the Alger Républicain. And he's assigned a series of, he's given a series of assignments, and many of them are very banal. They're faits divers that he has to cover. But it's a kind of apprenticeship in learning how to see things clearly. And this is a training that he begins with this newspaper and that he takes with him. And this is one of the great pivotal moments in his life. Am I fading in and out? Okay. It's in late 1938 that he takes on as an assignment a series of reports from Kabylia, which a mountain range to the east of Algiers, just in from the coast. And he spends a week out there reporting on the miserable condition of the Berber tribes living in that area. And the writing of these pieces is so spare, it's so stark, and he chooses his words extraordinarily carefully, and he refuses abstractions. He tells you exactly what he sees, what he feels, what he hears, what he touches. It's quite extraordinary. In many ways, it's reminiscent of what George Orwell does in his early journalism as well. For example, The Road to Wigan Pier, or Burmese Days. There are so many stunning parallels between the two men that it's surprising that a book hasn't been written on these parallel lives. But he trains in many ways, and this is why I think the division between journalism, philosophy, and novel writing is in a way a bit artificial, because they spill into one another. That same clarity of prose that he develops as a journalist, just as Orwell did, is then carried over into his philosophical essays, The Myth of Sisyphus and The Rebel, as well as into his novels. You have that same clarity, that same concision, and it's nearly a moral task on Camus' part. And I use that word carefully and deliberately. I think, for example, of the work of Iris Murdoch in her amazing short essay long essay, called The Sovereignty of Good, where she argues that morality, or making the right decision, or doing the good thing, is a question of seeing things more carefully. It's a question of making your sight more precise. This is what Orwell is doing. This is what Orwell does do, but this is what Camus is doing as well in his early journalism. And he continues this as the editor of the resistance newspaper Combat between 1942 and 1944. And it's as the editor of Combat that he writes a remarkable, they aren't printed in Combat, but printed elsewhere by other clandestine journals during the war and immediately after the war. He writes a series of 4 letters called Letters to a German Friend. And it's in these 4 letters that we see Camus begin to pivot away from what we think of as his existentialist stage. And in fact, Camus never thought of himself as an existentialist. In fact, he repudiated the term. He always tried to disassociate himself from French existentialism. But we see him making this pivot in these 4 letters to a German friend, where he realizes the books that he had started writing prior to the war, namely The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, 2 of the 3 books that constitute his first cycle, the cycle of the absurd, as he called it, that his diagnosis of man's condition, our absurd condition, is only that. It's a diagnosis. It's not a prescription, and it's not a cure. We have to move beyond that. And it's his experience in the resistance during the war that this realization comes to him. At a certain point in his journals, I believe in late 42 or early 43, he scribbles, absurdity teaches us nothing. And so he begins to make that move away from that early position that's expressed beautifully in these early works towards a one where I think it's given the title of this talk, the relevance of Camus for our own day, we might find an element to his work that is truly relevant given our own situation in a world that is swept by terrorism, by political inanity in our country as well as elsewhere, that he has something important to tell us in the second phase. The second phase, which is constituted by the rebel, the plague, and the just assassins. But I think we really do have to emphasize the importance of this notion of clarity and his allergic reaction to anything that abstracts us from the world as it is. And this is why I find your line about that he gives his writings the authority of sadness. I mean, it's beautiful, that line. But I think he also, with that sadness, he gives his writings the authority of conviction. That though one is sad, and that gives a certain kind of depth to one's analysis, that doesn't give us license to stand aside or to give up. Towards the very end of his life, he made the very important observation in his journal that it's only when we stop to struggle that we know despair. But as long as we continue to struggle, even though that struggle itself will never reach a resolution, that's cause not just for sadness, but for a kind of joy, a kind of satisfaction in this commitment that he finds perhaps early on with the figure he casts of Sisyphus, but really of Camus himself, that we need to imagine him happy in these struggles. There is the sadness, but there's also a kind of nobility that he undoubtedly felt during that last decade of his life, the 1950s.
I agree with all of that, Rob. I'd say three things that what you said makes me think of, and three among 100 reactions. One is, I think you're absolutely right that his training as a journalist was part of his immense good fortune, and ultimately among the immense good fortune of French letters, exactly because he wasn't a Normalian. He didn't think from the top down. Sartre did, for instance. He always thought from the bottom up, and that's part of the joy of being an observer. To trivialize it, in my own experience, I remember the happiest day of my life being the day I left graduate school to go write Talk of the Town for the New Yorker, because you had gone from a world of grand historical abstraction to a world of bizarre, eccentric people. And even though it was fait divers, nonetheless, that moment when a thinker is forced to become an observer is a hugely liberating one. And I think you're absolutely right. That was one of the things that he built his style and his accomplishment on. Second thing that I think about is the comparison of Orwell and Camus. It's something that I've spoken about at length. I once gave a lecture on it. I've written Parallel Lives of Darwin and Lincoln, but I've never actually tackled that book, but you may have given me an idea for next year's.
I first did.
Absolutely, but you take it. A couple of thoughts about that, because I think they speak both to English and French traditions and to the English and French experience of the 20th century. Orwell and Camus, without question, have in common not just a love of lucid language, but a feeling that lucid language is morality, that the two things are identical, that it's not just that it's instrumentally good to speak clearly, but that you cannot think clearly unless you're capable of speaking clearly. And they both were in rebellion, obviously against the ideological fog that covered over the reality, often the horrible reality of the European experiences that they had seen. But it strikes me as well that Orwell is committed to a kind of straightforwardness, a kind of very English kind of suspicion of abstract thought. Whereas Camus is at home with it, he just wants it always to have the check of reality. Orwell is capable of writing a wonderfully pointed satiric allegory, like Animal Farm, but he's not capable, I think, of writing a broadly applicable poetic parable like the myth of Sisyphus. That seems to me Camus' special gift and is part of a French tradition. It's the difference between the tradition of Swift on the one hand and La Fontaine on the other. And in that way, like as they are, they're also interestingly unlike in the way that they participate in their two traditions, it seems to me. The other thing I was thinking of as you spoke is how much greater, and I think again we see this if we think about Orwell and Camus side by side, the French challenge was at that moment than the British challenge, large though that was as well. Orwell's experience of the war had been an experience of privation, it had been an experience of the Blitz. It had hardly been easy or soft, but nonetheless, his country, his tradition, the values he believed in, the Labour Party and British socialism, were not directly implicated in the horror in the way that the French state had been, in the way that the French state and nation had been. Camus has to deal in the late 40s with not just with the problem of collaboration and what that tells you about the French tradition and about the French nation, the French state. He has to deal with the problem of revenge. What do you do with the collaborators? How do you treat them? Are they to be shot? Are they to be sentenced? Are they to be forgiven? And he ends up with that aphorism that I love. Justice in the extreme cases, in all else mercy. Right? It's beautiful, and I think
big cases.
Justice in the big cases.
Issues, right.
In the big cases, mercy in all else, which strikes me as good a motto to inscribe on any building as you could have. So Camus is dealing with. Talk about the big issues. He's dealing not only with how do you rebuild Britain after the war on a socialist model, communist model, not only dealing with Orwell's questions about Marxism and liberalism, he's dealing with core issues of how do you reconstruct a state and a republic out of its own ruins, and how do you explain how it came to be ruined? Do you accept the Gaullist explanation that it's all the fault of the Germans against a sinned against France with a handful of collaborators, or do you accept the view that there's something, Mark Bloch's view, that there's something deep and wrong in that strange defeat, which forces you to look at the very roots of your own tradition. So one of the things that I think makes Camus, much though I admire Orwell, an even more interesting writer is that his task is greater, his problem is larger, and I would even suggest that his range is wider too, in the way that I was saying before, that he's capable of, while always remaining committed to lucidity, the particular, the thing at hand, the observable. And just to add quickly, I've always thought that one of the things that clearly feeds that is his experience as an Algerian colonial. And he knows how complicated, and it's one of the things we should talk about, how complicated the actual fabric of colonial experience is, that it won't fit the neat categories of oppressor and oppressed. He thinks about his own mother, who's working as a domestic in Algeria. It doesn't fit the simple category of a colonial exploiter in that way. But that with all of his endless and ravishing appetite for the particular, he's not frightened by the philosophical.
No, he's not frightened by the philosophical. I wonder, though, about making this distinction between Camus' colonial experience as a pied noir in Algeria in the 1920s and 1930s, and Orwell, because we need to keep in mind that Orwell also had a colonial experience, and he was all too aware of the inequities of British rule in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. And
his best essay, to my mind, Shooting an Elephant.
It's a remarkable essay.
It's all about that.
And of course, there's that other essay, Hanging, where there's that marvelous moment, which is worthy of Camus, where a man sentenced to death, and Orwell, as a colonial officer, is obliged to oversee the execution, is being walked to the gallows. And the man, Orwell describes him with the same kind of care for detail that you find in Camus' description, for example, of somebody being put to death in his Reflections on the Guillotine. But at a certain point, this man who has an owl-like expression, if I recall correctly from the Orwell essay, he's being led to the gallows, and then the path is muddy. It had just rained, and there's a puddle. The man stops, looks at the puddle, and then walks around it. And he's going to die in a few minutes, but yet he did not want to get his feet muddy.
It's a Camusian moment.
A very Camusian moment. And so I do think that even the colonial experiences, and clearly Camus' colonial experience was so much deeper and more complex than Orwell's was. And I think you're right. Orwell doesn't have that breadth. He doesn't have that ease with philosophical terms. Though, of course, many critics of Camus in the 1950s thought that Camus didn't have that range and that breadth. He was often mocked by the normaliens, by those who had gone through the normal cursus of university study in Paris, as somebody who played at philosophy. And Camus himself insisted repeatedly that he was not a philosopher. And he was very careful to label the myth of Sisyphus and the rebel as philosophical essays, not works of philosophy, not treatises, but instead as essays. And one of his great models, somebody he read time and time again over the course of his life, was Michel de Montaigne, the inventor of the essay. And it's in the very nature of an essay that it's a trial. You grope towards a certain direction, you realize you're going in the wrong direction, and you pull away and you try a different direction. And just as Montaigne does in his essays in the 16th century, so too Camus does with his longer essays and at times denser essays in the 20th century. So he's willing to take on the philosophical challenge from Sartre and company, but opinion is divided as to whether or not he succeeded in meeting that challenge.
Well, that's certainly so. And one of the crucial episodes in French intellectual life in the 50s is the attack that Sartre has Janson launch against Camus. Doesn't do it directly himself, but he gives it to someone else to do. And the critique is exactly that Camus is not really up on his philosophy. He doesn't understand either Marxist dialectic sufficiently, nor Heideggerian phenomenology, that he's not really adept at either of these things. But what strikes me, to be honest, Rob, is that I think they're wrong and he's right.
I agree.
In those cases, that what they mean by philosophical, they don't use the word sophistication, but philosophical expertise is exactly what Camus is critical of. That is the skillful manipulation of empty abstractions in place of dealing with the actuality of lived experience. So in that way, it seems to me that Camus is aligned, interestingly, with a lot of the most interesting philosophers of the 1940s. I think, for instance, and it's interesting, Olivier Roy, in his biography of Camus, said, if only Camus had been in more touch with the people who were rethinking liberalism, not in the economic sense, but in the humanistic sense, the people who were rethinking liberalism in England and America at the same time. And he instances Karl Popper as one of the people who Camus was aware of, but not really fully capable of absorbing. And one of the things that fascinates me is that in both those cases with Camus and Popper, what you see is a rejection of history as an explanatory principle. In other words, the idea that you can make sense of the world, very powerful still in Sartre, by figuring out what the plot is in history and getting on the right side of it. That history justifies action and that history often justifies atrocity. That you can say it's too bad that bad things have happened, but history will justify them in the long run. And that's a line of reasoning, very powerful in 20th century thought, that Camus rejects vociferously, in the same way that Popper is rejecting it at the same time in the 1940s, first in New Zealand and then in London. So I would make the case that though Camus isn't as adept with the categories of philosophy as some of his critics, he's a far more potent philosophical mind, judged in retrospect, than the people who fancy themselves philosophers at the time.
No, I think you're right, Adam. I'm always saying that. I think you're right, Adam.
I say it too.
But I do think he's right. I thought he's right for years as I read his essays in the New Yorker. We might also be looking at the wrong place for his philosophy, or thinking about philosophy in the wrong way, or a slightly wrong way. And this is now becoming a cottage industry among professional philosophers in the United States. I think, for example, of the work of Martha Nussbaum, who makes this passionate, persuasive argument that the Greek tragedians, the playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, were perhaps more powerful philosophers than the Platos and the Aristotles. Because unlike Aristotle or Plato, the tragic playwrights know that at times there is no good answer. And that is the tragic nature of our life. And this is something that I think Camus understood in his very fibers. That we desperately want answers, but those answers are not to be had. And I said, I'm uncomfortable as I say this, because here we are, and we're all fairly comfortable, and yet emphasizing something that, in fact, has revolutionary consequences. We all live our lives based on the assumption that there's a direction, that there's a meaning to be gleaned. And I think the power of Camus' work is that he forces us to stop and reflect and say, well, that's not the case. But that's okay that it's not the case. And this is why I've taught Camus for years now at the University of Houston, and it's remarkable the reaction of my students to Camus. I teach a great books course. I've been doing it for a quarter of a century, and I've taught many different authors. But I find that the one author my students always respond to, in a way they do not respond to anybody else, with the possible exception of Stendhal, is Albert Camus. They have the impression that he's speaking to them, and that he's addressing questions they sensed, but were never fully expressed. And he's asking them to take the measure of their lives, to stop and think, what constitutes a life? What's the stuff of meaning? If there is no ultimate answer or meaning, what is it that we do? And at first that leads to a kind of aporia, the Greek term for being stunned or phased, a kind of paralysis. Well, what do we do? And that's the state that we find in his first cycle of works, the absurd. But then he does offer a kind of prescription, a kind of cure. And that is, and here I find, I was about to use the word relevant, and I hate that word. I hate it as a professor in the liberal arts because I'm always being pressured by my administration to prove that what I do is relevant. I don't know how to do that. And relevant, I think, is also an unfortunate term because the opposite of relevant is irrelevant. So at some point it would suggest that Camus will be irrelevant, or that he has an expiration date. And I don't think that's the case. I think a better choice of words would be timeliness and timelessness. And I think the reason why Camus is timely now, and this actually spills into his timelessness, is that at this point of aporia, and we look and we find no answer, no absolute, lasting, unchanging answer to these questions we pose naturally as human beings. We turn to our left, we turn to our right, and we discover that we're in the company of others. And that's where meaning is to be found, in that struggle. And this is where his tragic sense of life, which is not necessarily a sad sense of life, enters. That it's in the struggle. And he uses this pseudo-Cartesian term in The Rebel. The cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Well, Camus plays with that. And in The Rebel, he has this famous formula, I resist, therefore we are. It's in the act of resistance that we find community, and it's in that community that we find meaning. The meaning is not eternal, it's not lasting, but it's a source of comfort, it's a source of joy, it's a source of love. And this is something that I think often gets lost in when Americans talk about Camus, or perhaps even when the French talk about Camus. You'll need to tell me about that. Is that we think of existentialists in black and white, right? Turtlenecks or the upturned collars of their overcoats and their chain-smoking Gaulois, and they're shrouded in this veil of smoke, and that's not my Camus. I'm sorry. I'm claiming your grandfather. Okay, I'm appropriating him, as we say in the academy. My Camus is somebody who's a sensualist, who loved life, loved nature. The lyrical essays that he began to write in the 1930s and continued through the 1950s are absolutely ravishing. But this is not the Camus that we know. But this is the Camus who wants us, this I think is the Camus that Camus would want us to remember. This is the Camus who, for example, when he gave his acceptance speech at Stockholm for the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, kept on moving back and forth between this commitment he has to the humiliated. And it's an important word, the humiliated. This is the word that he chooses to use. But between his commitment to speaking on behalf of the humiliated, those who were mute, those who didn't have a voice, but also his commitment to beauty, we lose that side of Camus. And I think it's unfortunate because it reduces Camus to something that in life he simply wasn't.
Yes.
Finally,
all of that. All of that. Let me ask you though, I think that's true, and I think the core point that you're making can't be sufficiently stressed, and that is that you can view the loss of authority, of certainty, as a source of anxiety that pushes you to search for some other authority in Marxism or Nazism or the Communist Party of France or someplace else. Or you can view it as potentially liberating. You can view it as a source not of anarchy, but of life seen as an ongoing argument, as an ongoing improvisation, where, as you were saying, we resist and therefore make up meaning with each other. But let me press you, Rob, if I may, on some of the specifics of Camus' life, and I'm thinking specifically of Camus' silence. One of the things that I think reshapes, at times even warps, his reputation in France is his role during the Algerian War. As all of you know, or many of you may know, at the time of the Algerian War, Camus, which was, I think it would be fair to say, not unlike the period of the Vietnam War in America, where life became highly polarized, where this overseas war was ripping the country apart. And at a time when most of the people who shared his politics and his views were becoming increasingly anti-war, Camus was famously silent. Camus chose silence. And that fact, as I say, continues to affect the way he's seen in France and our understanding of him. What do you make of Camus' silence and his attitude about the Algerian War?
You're right. It's such a difficult question, and I don't have a good answer. By 1956, Camus was in desperate straits. Algeria was in desperate straits. And he committed himself to what we would call a Hail Mary pass. After consulting with friends who were still in Algiers, he decided to fly to Algiers to give a talk at a hall that was owned by a Muslim organization, because all the other public settings were closed to him by the government. And he went in order to speak on behalf of a civil truce. And he had already sketched out what he was going to say in Algiers in a series of editorials. He agreed to write for the newly born weekly magazine, L'Exprès, which was modeled after Time magazine. And the magazine had been created expressly, L'Exprès had been created expressly in order to bolster the candidacy of Pierre Mendès France to become
president.
For president. He had been in office for a year and a half. He had managed to extricate France from the mire, from the colonial bog in Indochina, as well as elsewhere in North Africa. And then he was going to turn to Algeria, but because of the complexities of parliamentary life and under the Fourth Republic, Mendès France's government fell, and he never was able to return to power. I should mention that next year is going to be the centenary of his birth, and I wonder if anybody's planning anything at all along those lines in France. A remarkable man who should be better known in the United States and perhaps even in France. So he went in order to give his pitch on behalf of a civil truce. And the gist of the truce was this: that the war between the FLN and the French army could continue. He could not stop that. What he hoped to stop, though, was the killing of civilians. And so he appealed. We've had a power outage.
Take my.
Thanks. Am I? Okay. And so he appealed to both sides in the conflict to spare the lives of the innocents. And he used a number of times the phrase, sauver les corps. We have to save human lives. And surely, he thought, on that issue, everybody could agree. As he famously said, we're condemned, we being the Pieds Noirs, the Arabs and the Berbers, were condemned to live together. As it turned out, they were condemned to keep on killing one another. The appeal went unheard. He had to finish it quickly because just outside the hall, there was a terrific press of protesters, Pieds Noirs, who were threatening to invade the assembly hall. Rocks were being thrown through the windows, and he insisted on giving the entire speech, and then he was hustled out by a number of friends from Algiers. And that was that. When he returned to Paris a few days later, he realized that his appeal didn't make a ripple in French political life. And it's at that moment that he decided to become silent. And he gave various reasons to different people. But the basic reason, I believe, was that there were no words left to express the tension. He was straddling two worlds that could not meet. On the one hand, he was fully committed to Republican ideals, and he had been arguing this case ever since the 1930s as a student, and then with his theatrical troops, and then as a newspaperman for Alger Républicaine. He was one of the few Pieds-Noirs in Algiers who argued for the giving of the same rights and privileges to Muslims and to Berbers, and to Arabs and to Berbers that were enjoyed by the Pieds-Noir community. So on the one hand, there's this commitment on Camus' part to these Republican ideals. On the other hand, there's an equally powerful commitment to the Pieds-Noirs, to his family, to the countryside. He saw himself not as a French Algerian, he saw himself as an Algerian who happened to be French. And so these two concerns, which were existential for Camus, could not be reconciled. When that happens, there are no words left. One does fall into silence. This is what happens quite often with Greek tragedy. At the end of a tragedy, the chorus sums things up because the protagonist, the antagonist, have nothing left to say. And so, what was one to do? And he was criticized for it. He was criticized by those on the left. He was criticized by those on the right. He was criticized famously by that student that he met at the University of Uppsala 2 days before he gave his Nobel address. What is one to do at that point? I think that silence at that point is the most eloquent of responses to the situation in which he found himself. And I might add that silence, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but silence is a theme that threads through Camus' life. It's something he's born into because his mother was deaf. She was semi-mute, and she was illiterate. Her brother, who lived in the house with them, or in the flat with them in Algiers, was also deaf and semi-dumb. He had just a small repertoire of words. And so, I'm sorry, I'm falling silent. And so silence was something that preoccupied Camus his entire life, and refers to this time and time again in his works. But perhaps the most touching, the most devastating reference is in the notes to his unfinished novel, The First Man, where, and I wish I could quote it verbatim, it doesn't come to me right now, but he writes more or less that he wishes his mother could have read his works, and it's her silence that he treasures. What does one do with that? One meditates on it, just as one meditates on Camus' silence after 1956. You don't need to hear me blabber on about it. It's just something that we need to think about.
Yes, I think that's true. Thank you. We're passing one microphone back and forth like a jug band in Greenwich Village in the early 60s. There's a bizarre Recherche reference for you. You have to be of a certain generation to have any idea what I'm referencing. I think it's true, Robin. I think that your delineation of Camus' agony is both very exact and very powerful. And one of the things that interests me about that moment in Camus' life is that it's exactly where any effort to think of Camus in a glib or facile way fails, because he doesn't have an answer there. And Camus at that moment reminds me often, if I may make a provocative comparison, of many of my friends on the Israeli left, for instance, among Israeli doves who have simultaneously a commitment to universalism and to human rights, and at the same time refuse from their own experience to think of themselves as a settler class or as a colonial class, who know that that is false to their own experience of what it means to be an Israeli. And I think again and again of Camus when I'm in dialogue with those friends, and I see in their agony his earlier agony reflected. And you're quite right that it's a kind of agony that, because it proposes incommensurable values, it doesn't lend itself to any solution and silences its own eloquence in the face of that kind of predicament.
And I also think that it's really a mark of political moderation when you recognize, as Camus did, that at times there are incommensurable truths or incommensurable goods. And there's no way of resolving or solving or bringing them together. You simply have to live with that fact. And this is the mark, and this is something that I think is not, it certainly isn't recognized in our culture today, and it wasn't in Camus' day in the 1950s, but this emphasis on moderation. Not moderation as a kind of wishy-washiness or passivity, a standing to one side and simply observing, but instead as the most intensive activities, where you, at a certain point, if you're being pushed, if your dignity as a human being is being questioned, at a certain point you say no. You say no because you are a human being. But you don't push back to the point where you lose sight of your opponent's humanity. And this balancing act requires extraordinary concentration. It requires great force and great dedication. And it's also a balancing act that sooner or later, inevitably, is going to fall apart. Either you're going to fall forward and become as brutal and as inhuman as the person that you are responding to, or you'll fall to the other side and become something of a mediocrity, right? And so I think we need to keep in mind that Camus is offering a kind of political moderation, or he embodied a kind of political moderation, and he wrote about it elusively in The Rebel, that more than ever is timely today.
I think that's right, and I think that I know we want to open it up to some questions
Right.
before we go, but before we do, let's return, if we can, Rob, to where we began, talking about Camus and New York. And we were thinking about the particulars of his voyage here and the things he found and discovered, but let's broaden it out a little bit and think about what Camus' example means for New Yorkers like us, some of us, and for Americans today. You said a moment ago, and I think it's very true, that there's a notion of a kind of tough moderation in Camus, a moderation that isn't simply choosing the wishy-washy edge of things, but a belief in the power of what we might call, in the American context, pragmatism, not as a weak solution, but as a powerful one that calls on all of our capacities for moral improvisation, for breaking free of stereotype thinking, and in all of those ways. Camus remains a kind of political hero. I suppose I show my own political allegiances and prejudices when I say that one of the fascinating things about watching the evolution of President Obama in the past 8 years is to think of him in those kinds of terms. Somebody under enormous pressure, struggling again and again to maintain a position that will not choose an extreme edge, but at the same time doesn't simply become pliant to the radical forces that he faces. And when I see Barack Obama struggle to keep his cool in the face of wild provocation without simply becoming cold, without simply becoming inert, I recognize many of the themes that you're talking about. And in that sense, without exaggeration, I think that Camus' model of what it is to be engagé, to be engaged in the world, isn't just piously useful to us, it's pragmatically useful to us in thinking about politics and in thinking about the politicians that we admire. In that way, for me, Camus remains not just a remote model, not just a figure of the 40s or of the 50s, but he remains a very potent and present model.
I agree once again. And you've shown a great deal of moderation in not either walking out or not overwhelming us with questions. So, but perhaps we should now turn to the audience. We've gone on long enough, more than an hour. So please, if there are any questions for Adam.
We only have one microphone.
Okay, we have a mic here, so
Right.
if you need to be heard, you need to wait for the mic, please.
At this time,
We can hear you.
in the mid-40s, de Gaulle and his big supporter, Malraux, were very
I'll repeat the question.
What was Camus' attitude towards political activity of de Gaulle?
The question is about Camus and de Gaulle. Interesting question. Camus' attitudes towards de Gaulle, Malraux, and the Gaullist movement. Rob?
This is when an essayist passes over to a scholar.
Well, de Gaulle comes to power in 1958, just 2 years before Camus' death. He met de Gaulle once. He was impressed by de Gaulle, and he thought that de Gaulle's assumption of power during the crisis of May 1958 was a welcome. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was attending about 1946 to 47,
That's-
when de Gaulle first came to power.
Oh, under the provisional government.
Yeah, when Malraux
Right after the war.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Malraux was like heroes, who mostly existentialists.
right, but Andre Malraux was not yet the Andre Malraux that he becomes in 1958 when de Gaulle, with the birth of the Fifth Republic, creates a Ministry of Culture. And that's really a gift to Andre Malraux. And so we shouldn't telescope events too dramatically. Camus recognizes de Gaulle's authority, and he sees there's no other individual who can channel and unify both the internal resistance as well as the Free French movement that was based in London until 42 and then moved to Algiers following the invasion of North Africa. He also what de Gaulle's provisional government, Camus also applauded the laws introduced by the provisional government under de Gaulle. It's only in 1945, under the provisional government, that women are given the vote. It's under de Gaulle's provisional government that many of the demands that were voiced in the Charter of the Resistance that was published clandestinely in late 43 or early 44 were realized. And you have this remarkable sight of a traditional authoritarian Catholic figure, Charles de Gaulle, overseeing this revolution in French political life. Of course, de Gaulle, being de Gaulle, wanted to run this revolution, and when he found that he could not, he retired from political life. It would not reappear for another 12 years. But the little that I know about Camus' thoughts about de Gaulle were mostly positive.
I'll talk. I feel it very elementary. My question is in terms, can you speak in terms of any Arabic literary element in Camus' writings? Because his mother was I think it was Arabic, right?
No, she wasn't. She was from the island of Mallorca. She was Spanish.
She was Spanish.
Sintes. It was a Spanish family from Mallorca, the island off the coast. So no, there's no.
But he, at least he has like about probably 1/3, because the Arabs were in Spain for a long time.
Well, I haven't done a genealogy.
Can,
I think, if I'm wrong, I think Camus said that the American tragedy was that Americans don't have a sense of the tragic. And I was just wondering how you square that with, I think you were saying your students were attracted to him because of his sense of the tragic, your students in Texas. And I also was wondering whether you care to speculate on what George Bush, the second Bush, might have seen in The Stranger. He apparently was attracted to that book for some reason. I'm not suggesting that the two questions are related.
Do you want to take up this question, The Stranger?
I actually wrote a comment for the New Yorker when it came out that on Bush's summer reading list, it was like the summer of 2005, I think, sometime like that, was The Stranger. It was a very ambitious reading list, a suspiciously ambitious reading list that summer. But to give, let's take him at his word, I think that the question of violence and violent acts is one that speaks to anyone. You're right about Camus' bon mot, about his aphorism. And one of the odd things about American life, and I wonder if this isn't one of the reasons why Rob's students embrace Camus, is that we have plenty of experience of the tragic. We just have amnesia about our own experience. So that it's one of the themes that I was writing. I wrote a book about that was in part about Lincoln, and it's one of the interesting things about Lincoln is that Lincoln stands out in this time because he's not only an executioner of a kind, he's a leader of an army, but he's aware of it. He's aware of the costs of war. He's an interesting and American exception because he doesn't have amnesia about the consequences of his actions. And that's one of the things that gives him a special kind of dignity in American life. Just coming back to your question for a moment, not to escape it, one of the most interesting books, and now I will have the thing that happens to us as we go through our 5th decade. I will forget the name of the author, but I think Alice will help me here, Alice Kaplan. There's a very interesting book that came out just a couple of years ago in France, which sees the story of the stranger from the opposite side. Kamel Douaoudou, thank you very much. I knew you'd have it. I couldn't think of the name. And it's a fascinating novel because what it says is that the Arab who is killed on the beach at the beginning of the book in an act of existential despair, in an act of absurdist self-assertion, we're never entirely sure, we're not meant to be sure, that he has a history and an individuality and a specificity that Camus has overlooked or that Camus has negated. And it's an extraordinary book, and it's one of the really enriching secondary pieces of imaginative literature that Camus has inspired. I think it's translated into English.
It is. The Meursault controversy.
Right, that's right.
Investigation.
The Meursault investigation,
Right.
that's right. It's a terrific and a fascinating book, exactly in terms of thinking about Camus from the other side. Someone else?
One of you mentioned the famous passage in The Rebel concerning I rebel, therefore we exist. And you mentioned that as sort of part of our communal experiences with things. But whenever I read that, I'm always thinking of Camus sort of as a reader of Schopenhauer in a sense. Like, how does he overcome this sort of hardships and suffering that come within that what happens when we come into contact with other people? Because was not Camus sort of influenced by Schopenhauer in some sense? Not at all, no?
Not that I'm aware of.
We're all influenced by Schopenhauer. It's like a line from Woody Allen, right? The influence of Schopenhauer on my life is enormous. But I think it's true. I think if I may take it, whether this specifically inspired by Schopenhauer or not, you're quite right to remind us that the struggle that Camus was taking part in is one of the deep struggles of modernity. That is about how, once you dissolve authority, you dissolve inherited authority, how do you make your way? And it's hardly original to Camus to look at that question. What gives Camus, I think, such power still is the combination of the immediacy of his experience for us and his ability to convey that experience in immediate terms, and it's, for lack of a better word, its accessibility. It's that it's not something we have to puzzle our way through. It's something that we can experience our way through along with him.
One little point and then two questions. The point was that Jack Neufeld, in his biography of Robert Kennedy, says that when after his brother was assassinated, I mean, Camus was his major source of strength, you might say.
I think, because it's funny, because I've just been reading about Bob Kennedy, I think along with Aeschylus.
Yeah.
Neufeld.
Well, that fits together.
Yeah.
Because, and I think that, I wanted to say is that, Robert, I thought your discussion about the tragic dimension and the effort to balance, the being caught in an impossible situation is really the experience of the tragic. But I think it's absolutely crucial that we do not use the word moderation as a translation from Messier. That's the critique I raised of your book and all. And I think the point is that falls into exactly the trap which the left attacked him for and which the right, you might say, celebrated him for, but it's what he tried to counter, and specifically, explicitly. For example, his response to the Sartre-Camus controversy, in the unpublished article that he wrote in defense of the rebel, he tries to make that exactly clear, that rebellion and revolution are integrally related. And the word measure is being used in the classic Greek sense, just like you took the tragic, just like the way it's used by Heraclitus. It's a question of a tragic balance. It's not a moderation. The word and the translation of that, and it's Bauer's translation of the rebel, it's a disaster, and it leads us into a whole lot of political difficulties, which I won't go into here. So but I think that's a crucial point. Now the question I want to raise to you is, have you thought about, it's for both of you, have you thought about, you talk about the significance of him and why he resonates so much, have you thought about the mythic nature of his titles? You just stop and think about the titles. The Stranger, The Rebel, The Fall, The Myth of Sisyphus, Exile in the Kingdom, and you can go on to talk, there are others, right? There's a mythic dimension which, so how you relate that mythic dimension to the concrete, which I think both of you so beautifully articulated, it's a fundamental tension, but the mythic dimension, I think, grasps something as absolutely fundamental with respect to Camus' grasp, you might say, the pervasive metaphysics of Western civilization and culture. I think that's the resonance that's going on there. But I invite you to comment about that.
Whenever anyone raises a question about the pervasive metaphysics of Western civilization, I always pass it on to Rob.
And I pass out.
So I know Rob will want to speak to or may not want to speak to the moderation balance controversy, which is always, of course, sort of kinds of problems with translation. Let me just add quickly that I agree with you, and I think one of the things, and I was trying to say it before, no doubt, ineloquently, that one of the things that makes Camus interesting, and to my mind separates him from even an interesting figure like Orwell, is exactly that he has access to that kind of poetic parable in an easy way. He has a mythopoeic imagination to go along with his particularizing eye. And I think that's the tension between those two things that gives him, among other things, his stature as a literary figure.
Yes, lady here.
Camus spent some months in hiding in this famous village or town in the Cevennes, where there were also, I forget how many Jewish children being hidden. Did he ever comment on this experience about the courage of the Huguenot pastor and peasants and the tragedy of these Jewish children who had to live those years in fear and hiding?
Yes and no. Yes and no. It was in late 1942, as most of us know, I think, Camus had tuberculosis, and he had, after the invasion and occupation of France, he returned to Algeria, but not to Algiers, but to Oran with his wife, Francine Faure. And he had attacks of tuberculosis, and his doctor, a Jewish doctor who could not practice because he was Jewish, suggested that he go to the Cevennes for his lungs. And so in the fall of 1942, he does that. And it's shortly after that the Allies invade North Africa, and the Germans, in response, occupied what was until then the free zone. And in his journal, he wrote, "Trapped like a rat." And so there he was in the Cevennes, and he was in a village called Chambon-sur-Lignon. And I imagine that many of you know the story of Chambon. It's been written about eloquently by Philip Halley in a book published years ago, still in print, called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. And Camus did not live in Chambon itself. He lived outside at a farmhouse called Le Penalier. And we don't know if he knew what was taking place in Chambon. It seems, for me, it's very hard to believe that he did not know. In part because his novels are sprinkled with characters whose names are the names of individuals who are playing this remarkable role in Chambon. For example, the doctor in Chambon was a Dr. Riou, R-I-O-U, I believe. And it just requires a little bit of fiddling with that name to have Dr. Rieu, who is the narrator and the hero of the play. The novel itself was being sketched during those years. It's published in 1947, and ultimately the question of whether or not he knew, I think, is irrelevant. What is important is that there was a convergence between what was taking place with André Trocmé and the villagers of Chambon, and what Camus was attempting to do both in the resistance, or eventually when he joins the resistance, and in his writing. And it's just a remarkable, remarkable moment, not just in his life or in the life of the villagers of Chambon, but in all of our lives in history.
Thank you, wonderful, beautiful. I'm going to try as a question to relate what I'm hearing, not having read Camus at all, to the National Institute on Aging Summit Conference from which I just came this morning. The idea that Camus' view of thinking, and I think many in the audience, are what the National Institute on Aging is trying to achieve in the scientific community, to get them to see not only the leaves and details and evidence in which they exist, but to see the big branches and the trunk. The NIA forbade the speakers at this conference from talking about the leaves. Am I understanding you correctly?
I would put it slightly differently, and it's not unlike the comment I was making on your neighbor's question. And that is, what interests us about any good writer is not one attribute that she might possess, but a tension between two seemingly opposed attributes. It's invariably, that's what makes an interesting writer interesting. And it's exactly, it seems to me, in your terms, what we've been trying to articulate about Camus is that he's a writer who's interested in every leaf on every tree, but is also interested in the ecology of the forest. And it's the tension between his gift for philosophical reflection, for philosophical improvisation, if you like, for philosophical abstraction even, and his attention to the particulars of experience, that, and his ability to convey those particulars lucidly, that give his work its special dimension, that continue to make it resonant for us today. So I'll tell you something about aging that I was reading not long ago that made me think of Camus, if I may add. It was something that was being written by a psychologist who was studying, and it's something that we've been experiencing in our family recently, or the last few years, very sadly, the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia in aging patients. Because one of the things that happens is that you can lose that people feel that they've lost the person, right? And what doesn't tend to get lost is the moral core of the person, the way they relate to their caretakers. Even if they've forgotten everything else, people can still recognize the moral core of a human being in their relation to others. And that if that remains intact, no matter what else is lost, the person is still there. That seems to me a very Camusian reflection on what it is to be human.
So
Yes.
let me just comment.
Yeah.
The NIA is trying to get both,
Right.
Camus. But they do this by forcing scientists to
To not to talk about. That's a great.
aiming for Camus.
That
That's my interpretation.
if you can have a scientific conference where people just don't talk about
The nearest leaf to them, it's a great thing. Scholarly conference of any kind. I think we're coming to the end. I think we can take one more question, lady here.
Okay, a quick comment and question. I read the Myth of Sisyphus when I was in high school, and I was suicidal at that time. They convinced me not to do it. It really did. The fact that Camus died in the essence, in the fullness of life, tells me that he was convinced of the struggle being
Worth
an essential part of the life of a man or a woman or anyone at all. That's a comment. Now my question is, as I know neither of you are his biographers, but the fact that he was a freedom fighter, all right, how does that reflect upon his volume of work?
May I first say something about the question of aging and about your comment? There is an amazing moment in The First Man where the protagonist, Jacques Commemorating, visits the cemetery where his father, who died in the Battle of the Marne in 1914 when Commemorating/Camus was just 1 year of age. And he's looking at the gravestone and the dates, and suddenly he's hit with a realization that he is older now than his father was when he died. And I think in a way that I was out of the country last week with my family, and we were in Costa Rica surfing. And I was standing on the beach, and I was thinking about this conference, or agonizing over it, as I watched my kids surf. And I realized that I'm so much older than Camus was when he died. And it's only then, last week, that this realization hit me. And like you, with your experience reading The Myth of Sisyphus, how it saved your life, quite literally. Moments like this in Camus have, if not saved my life, have forced me to reassess and revalue my life. And I thought about that moment in The First Man, and I thought, my goodness, I am that much older, much too older. But that's not a reason to despair. That's a reason to continue to do what you can to make things better. Now, as far as being a freedom fighter, it radiates through his work. As I mentioned earlier, he refused to divorce his work as an artist with his work as an individual whose duty was to speak truth to power. And we know, despite his weaknesses, despite his foibles, despite those blind spots, that this was precisely what Camus was about, was speaking truth to power, powers that in various ways constrained, constricted, oppressed other people who could not speak for themselves. And you find this in his novels, you find this in his philosophical essays, you find it in his everyday life. For example, one thing that we haven't mentioned is that during his silence after 1956, he did not stop acting. What was brought to light recently by a young woman, a literary specialist at UC Irvine, Eve Morrissey, is a stack of letters that Camus wrote on behalf of FLN prisoners who had been sentenced to die. Lawyers, an old friend of his, as well as Giselle Halimi, a remarkable figure who was just starting her career, were appealing to Camus to intervene with the government, with the president, René Coty, to stop these executions. The president has very few powers, or had very few powers in the Fourth Republic, but he had the power to pardon. And Camus accepted. He read each of the dossiers with great care, and he wrote letters asking that these prisoners not be put to death. They were all put to death, but he continued to write.
I can't imagine a more eloquent place, both on personal and historical grounds, to end this conversation. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.